Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the event. We're so pleased to have you. I'm Rebecca Winthrop. I am the co-director of the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. And on behalf of my co-host, Jose Munoz, who's the interim director of the Institute for Educational Leadership and the director of the Coalition for Community Schools, we're really pleased you could join us today. This event, to make sure you're in the right place, is maximizing new federal relief dollars for student success and community development, Next Generation Community Schools Forum. And it is a follow-on event from work that Jose and I and many others on this call and off this call have done collectively together on the task force for Next Generation Community Schools. And in case you are joining us and are unfamiliar with what a community school is, there's many nuanced ways to think about it, but the task force has put out a high-level vision of 4 pillars. So a community school should have expanded and enriched learning time. A community school should have deep and active family and community engagement. A community school should have collaborative leadership practices, and a community school should have integrated student supports. And we really believe that this model, this approach was well tested in COVID and really meets the moment for COVID recovery. We have a fabulous slate of panelists. I am in a moment going to turn over to Jose to frame our discussion and share his insights from years worth of experience on this topic. And then we are going to turn over to our colleague, Kristen Harper, who's the Director of Policy and Outreach at Child Trends, and she will lead a lightning round discussion with 3 phenomenal panelists. First, we have Catarina Sandoval, Deputy Secretary of Education from New Mexico. Then we will have Sarah Jonas, Acting Executive Director of the Office of Community Schools of the New York Department of Education. And finally, we will have State Senator Irvin from Arkansas. And then we will close with a conversation Jose will lead with a wonderful woman, Hema Quetzal, who is a student. She's a sophomore at Stanford University, but most importantly, she attended a community school in Oakland and came up through the community school system and is the co-chair of the Next Generation Coalition Network. So thank you all. That's the master plan. And with that, Jose, I'm going to turn over to you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And I want to say thank you for joining us right now for a very timely and important conversation about how to use this influx of funding for community schools in our community. So I also want to say thank you to Brookings and everyone who is on a task force for putting all of our minds together, our collective minds, to really think about a new generation for community schools coming forward. And I'd be remiss not to thank the legends of the Coalition for Community Schools, but also the existing steering committee, and all those who may have served on the Coalition steering committee, because they were trailblazers. For myself, as you say, the many years of community schools that I've spent, they were trailblazers in making a path forward for us all in the community school movement. And the ones that existing right now in the steering committee are still being trailblazers on there. So the coalition itself, just a quick description, we're really an alliance of local, state, and national leaders from many different organizations, many different sectors and walks of life, because that is what a community school looks like on the ground. And we come collectively together to put all of our advocacy, all of our will and ability and our desires and our talents together to create pathways for those who are doing community schools now in local communities, for those who are supporting children, supporting their families, working together for educating our future, employing currently now family members, and really caring for people during their times of stress. The coalition itself has a huge vision of 25,000 community schools by 2025. Ironically, our steering committee put that vision together before the pandemic. And we worked hard to really advocate for all the folks who are interested in and who are currently doing community schools so they can not just sustain this work, but grow this work. So coming into the pandemic, we're coming out of one of the hardest year that we've all had to face. Our children are still disconnected from school and disconnected from home. They have endured such stress in their lives, in their home life. Parents and families have lost jobs and have been disconnected from health and from each other for an entire year and ongoing. And we're starting to crawl into this space. There's been, of course, people know the justice issues that we have faced socially, health-wise, and economically. We have seen folks just disconnected in the forms of internet access and opportunities before and after school time of how do we even get back to work as a community, as a nation, if we don't have caring adults even caring for our children. But in the crux of it all, what we've heard after engaging folks through multiple town halls and many discussions across the United States and actually other countries as well too, was what we learned about the power of community schools and the need for it at this moment in time right now. Why do I say that? Because what really worked during this moment was actually the lived experience that people were experiencing before, the relationships they built, and the lived experience they're experiencing right now during the pandemic came together through a school. It evened out a lot of the inequities we face and exacerbated some of the ones that we still need to change. So we found that schools themselves, when they had the ability to coordinate the relationships, fared well. When they had the ability to collaborate across the different stakeholders, the different beliefs, paradigms that folks have, even politics, that they fared well. But we also learned during this time, having material and things alone does not work for the future of our children and the right now of our families. So community schools, as far as what they really do well, is take all the lived experiences, increase the communication between neighbors, help them collaborate better and more consistently, but make sure they're coordinating so our young people and our families are not only have a voice at the table, but they're part of the solution and creating a better future for themselves and caring for themselves in the moment right now. So we're at a point right now in our country with all the advocacy, and I thank all those who've advocated for community schools over the decades, and even right now, where community schools is on a presidential platform. It crosses the political divide of Republican or Democrat. It is not just bipartisan, it's nonpartisan. It's about children, it's about families, it's about working together, it's about unifying communities. Yes, there are pillars that were based off of years of study and evaluations where you do engage families deeply. You do provide the supports that they need to mitigate the stress, but we don't stay there. If we only stayed there for a community school, we stay at the bottom of Maslow's pyramid. Community school also creates opportunities to further the future. And so we're in a space right now where the funding, billions of dollars are being released. I think by May 24th, LEAs, local education agencies, will be receiving the American Rescue Plan dollars and have 90 days to actually collaborate with stakeholders and put together a plan. States are probably in the process right now, I hope, of collaborating with stakeholders to put together a plan by the first week of June. We know the Department of Education is working hard and tirelessly as a coalition. Partners are working with them to help educate folks of how to use those dollars for community schools. We need a strategy. We need a strategy that attends to the needs of families. We need a strategy that brings people together to meet the demand. We need a strategy to continue the sustainability of how we begin to unify and have a racial justice, but also racial healing. How we have inclusion of all the voices, including those with disabilities, and how we dismantle the systems and transform them to break down the barriers that are associated with class. And so right now, community schools, that moment, we have resources to do so. So what we're going to hear today, as Rebecca talked about, is three great stories talking about that we can use this money and we can build systems to sustain. We can see outcomes really fast in the most complex systems in the world. And there's no better time than to start right now and start by building some infrastructure for us alone. So I'm going to pass it over to our panelists, and I hope you all ask questions within that to Kristen Harper, who's going to lead us through our discussion. Hi, Kristen.
Hi, Jose. Good afternoon, all. This is Kristen Harper. I am Director of Policy and Outreach at Child Trends. We are a research institute devoted to improving outcomes for children, youth, and families. I am thrilled to be facilitating our Promising Practices lightning round with today's speakers to share how actors across communities can use federal funding to expand community schools. To remind the audience, each speaker will have about 10 minutes to speak, and then we'll give the audience about 10 minutes after each speaker for questions and answers. Please do feel free to use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit your questions at any point during today's event. And during today's discussion, we absolutely encourage you to tweet using the hashtag community schools. So for our first promising practice, we'll hear about how short-term relief dollars can be used by policymakers and practitioners to expand community schools while developing braided funding approaches to help community schools become sustainable. And our first speaker is Catarina Sandoval, Deputy Secretary of Education of New Mexico. Catarina, please share with us your work to support families and communities in New Mexico and promote learning, strong nutrition, mental health, and physical health.
Thank you, Kristen. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel and share my experience with community schools in my state. New Mexico currently has 80 community schools in operation across the state. And we have had a long history of developing the infrastructure, getting to the place where we are now to sustain this strategy. And New Mexico, as you may know, is one of the poorest states in our country. And so I just want to preface my presentation to say, as one of the poorest states in the country, we have found ways to sustain this strategy over time. And I know that we can do it collectively across our state. And I hope that my experience as a school principal, my own experience as a student in public schools, and now as a state administrator at the public ed department, will share kind of our story in New Mexico and how we're using this strategy. And so our state over time has really used the community school strategy to combat the effects of poverty. As one of the poorest states in the country, you can imagine the kind of effects that poverty and concentrated poverty, generational poverty has had on our families and students. Everything from lack of access to social and behavioral health supports to poor academic gains. And so we really have built upon the history of Title I, the Title I program in particular that is meant to combat poverty, to build off of that to get to the place we are today. So I was born and raised in Albuquerque, which is the biggest city in our state. And to give you a sense of kind of the rural nature of our state, even though I was born in Albuquerque, I grew up on an acre of land with chickens and a small farm, and my neighbors had horses and goats, and that's not uncommon in Albuquerque. And so we definitely, the vast majority of our state is definitely rural, agricultural based, lots of dairy land. And I was raised in a trailer, a mobile home, which again is not uncommon for most of the families in our state to grow up in a mobile home. I didn't realize I was poor until I went away to college, which is not uncommon, right? When you're growing up in concentrated poverty, you and your friends and your family have a roof over your house, over your home, your heads. And so you really don't get that perspective until you leave. But when I was attending elementary school in the 70s, I remember distinctly and I didn't know that it was funded through Title I, but there were dental clinics that came to my classroom where we learned how to brush our teeth and how to floss. We would get our teeth checked for cavities. I remember getting winter jackets and winter shoes all through the school for all of the students. And again, that was all through Title I. And that, as I reflect now, was really the infrastructure our state began to build off of. That was a strength that we wanted to continue to combat the effects of poverty in our schools. So after college, I came back home, and this was in the mid to late 90s. And at that point in time, our state legislature, like many of our states, was contemplating legislation around charter schools. And so our state passed the Charter Act in 1999, and we were one of the first charter schools to open. So my co-founder and I really wanted to open a school that was based in our community, building off the strengths of our families and really outwardly facing, so that we were open to the community and serving the needs of all of our families. And that the wraparound services that we would provide as a school would help mitigate the effects and challenges of growing up poor. So for example, we instituted an advisory program. Relationships are a strength, and we wanted to build relationships between staff, students, and their families, as well as among families themselves. So we definitely, through with the advisory program, we're able to learn firsthand from families what their challenges were and what they could contribute to our school community. We learned very quickly that parents and families were very interested in learning English. We serve a high number of families who speak Spanish as their first language. We heard from parents that they were interested in legal assistance with their immigration status. And so we were able to partner with community-based organizations like the New Mexico Migrant Law Center so that they could provide law clinics directly on campus after hours. They wanted to learn how to use a computer so that they could fill out job applications online. And so we very quickly, through our advisory program, started to hear about how we could support our families and their overall economic well-being. And as those relationships continued, definitely heard from parents and families that when they were in economic distress, they were looking for work. And how could the school support them as they developed their skill set and really be able to work and provide for their family. So as a community school staff, we discussed these things. We brought these issues to the table with our board, and we decided that we wanted to, as much as possible, employ our parents in areas that they could. So for example, we started off our custodial services, our groundskeeper, all fathers from our families, our kitchen staff. We definitely in the RFP process gave points and made it clear that we would award extra points to companies that would hire our parents. We worked with parents to get their ITIN number if they were not yet a legal citizen, so they could work as a contractor. So we did all of this because we knew that we would be able to provide services to families to build their own capacity to better be able to provide for their students. We also developed a service learning program. So it became part of our core academics. Again, the idea that the school is based in serving and building capacity and empowerment for our communities. So it's a high school. So in 9th grade, students would be placed at an elementary school in the community, almost always the very own elementary school that they attended. And so for 3 hours a week, they would be placed in an elementary classroom to work on their literacy skills. And so they would do read alouds, they would sit and be reading partners with elementary students in their own community. 10th grade would then focus on a nonprofit placement. So students were out working at a nonprofit, learning about what is a nonprofit, why are there so many homeless people, in this community, and how does this organization meet their needs? Junior year was actually then a focus towards work-based internship sites. And so we help students learn how to do an interview. The clothing bank at our community school would provide them, if they needed it, with professional attire. If they didn't have access to that or didn't understand, how am I supposed to dress for an interview? How am I supposed to dress for the workplace? And then the final part of our program was the Senior Action Project, where students now would pick a problem of practice, an area that they were really interested in exploring about the community. So for example, one of our students, again, coming from an agricultural based community, we had lots of students whose families were farmers and had lots of experience in farming. So his senior action project was to create a farm at our school and a greenhouse, and to incorporate that as part of the science curriculum. To this day, and this was nearly 20 years ago, to this day, the greenhouse is still there and the farm is still operational. And now that was my experience as a principal and as a student. And now in our state, we have over 80 community schools in operation. We now have a state funding mechanism to help take this strategy to parts of our state, especially in the rural areas that may not have the kind of technical assistance or community of practice that Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and Las Cruces do, which are our three major metro areas. So our legislature has been wonderful. They've been hearing directly from practitioners about the benefits of this strategy to organize and braid your funding and all funding. And so many of our community schools have learned how to leverage and sustain this model, primarily using Title I. So in my case, the major expense to make a community school run is a coordinator. You do need a full-time person to coordinate all of the services, all of the relationships with community-based organizations, and it does take that person to do it. What's wonderful about it is it could be a parent. Many community schools in our state, again, promoting the skill set and also the autonomy of our families, will actually hire parents to serve as the coordinator. It can be a teacher. You can create the job description with your district in such a way that it best meets the needs of your schools and your communities. And so really, I would say the first funding leverage to pull is Title I. It's very flexible. It's most definitely aligned to this strategy, and it can definitely be used to pay your coordinator. In addition to Title I, other federal programs are also aligned to this kind of work. For example, Title IV, Part A, which is after school and enriched activities, would be directly aligned to support a coordinator who would coordinate all of those activities for your families. And we're very fortunate with our state legislature. We're now entering year 3 of a brand new state program to encourage the implementation and development of more communities across our state. So this is all through state monies. We have something known as the Extended Learning Time Program, which is really specifically meant to make school days longer and add additional years to the calendar. It's an optional program for districts, but what it does is it provides additional funding so that, for example, a community school that wants to provide access to students who normally wouldn't have access to enrichment activities like martial arts, dance, music, the performing arts, that can all be offered through an after-school program in a community school. And this additional state funding allows schools more funding to pay teachers, to run a late bus, and to extend your day so that students are at school longer. They're actually served a dinner meal in many instances before they go to their program. And so we continue now as a state to promote that program. We also have a grant program specific to community schools. There's a planning grant of $50,000 a year where they just take time to do a needs assessment. What are the needs of our community and what are the assets? And so we have a protocol where they're able to do that, and then they submit an actual plan to the Department of Education the following year. And that would then qualify them to be eligible for what we call the implementation grant. And over the course of 3 years, it's just enough money. It's $150,000 a year to be able to pay their coordinator. And the technical assistance we provide during that 3-year period is specifically how to braid your federal funds, your state funds, so that you can continue it once the grant program is done. Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you so much. And we'll shift to Q&A now. So if folks have questions, please do submit. And Katarina, we have received, a first question. In California, our California Partnership for Future Learning is encouraging school districts to hire families to serve in multilingual family engagement liaison positions. But we are hearing that there are barriers to doing so. Not sure if it has to do with labor commitments or other hurdles. How can we learn about how you created these positions in alignment with labor? Did you have to coordinate with the school district?
Great question. Yes, we had to coordinate with the school district, and we did have to interface with our labor partners. And we were fortunate, our labor partners really understood the need to bring in families as much as we possibly could. And so that was through both informal and formal conversations and negotiations with our labor partners, but we were able to get there. And they were able to say, yes, it makes sense for our students and families to be able to hire families who could serve in those kind of capacities. We were also able to, again, Title I, the parent set aside amount, right, for parent engagement. We said we're going to tap into that funding stream first, which is specifically for parent engagement, and then leverage other funds, Title I and others, to make that whole. But yeah, it's been wonderful to do that.
We had a follow-up question about what does the structure look like to develop the capacity of parents to serve in these positions? So perhaps it was the Title I set aside for parental engagement, but what did the what practices or infrastructure did you need to put in place to support parents to serve in those positions?
Mm-hmm. Great question. I would say developed over time. So first through our advisory program, and it can be through the asset and needs assessment, right, in the community school model, to really get a sense from your parents and families, what are their strengths and what are their needs. For us, it was all around economics, right? So they identified everything from, I don't have a computer, I don't know how to use a computer, but I need to apply for jobs that are online. So we developed a program around that. Then it was everything from learning English to earning a GED. So that was kind of the phase one, are kind of those basic, what I would call access tools, right? To be able to participate in access and basic kind of job seeking and employment opportunities. And then from there, as we continue to do that and build those relationships, and we started to hire our own parents, then it became very much relational and word of mouth, where community-based organizations, right, that's the other lever you can pull, where you're not doing all of these classes yourselves, and we certainly didn't. We held law clinics, really important for the families we serve, because many of them only had an ITIN number, right? And so they were wondering, can I still work legally and have an ITIN number? Yes, you can. And so, but we had lawyers come in from the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center to do that work on our behalf. So we definitely leveraged our relationships with community-based organizations to build that infrastructure over time.
One of the reasons we asked this, we really wanted to put forward, this practice piece in the lightning round, was just to address, the concerns from many who may be considering using, new federal dollars available for community schools, to help them think about, if those federal dollars are used for community schools, how can they really think about sustainability? So we have some questions also in just getting into the nitty gritty about, how much funding is really needed for a planning grant versus how much is needed for implementation, to support implementation. Could you give, just what has your experience been? You said, I think you said 50,000 for the planning grant, and then, how much really is needed to begin with implementation?
Sure, great question. So in our state, we legislators We're very supportive of the grant program. And so for implementation, it's for 3 years and it's $150,000 a year. And the bulk of that money is to be used to pay for your full-time coordinator. Now, a full-time coordinator with salary and benefits shouldn't cost districts in our state more than $100,000, right? So we do provide a little bit of extra funding for everything from, and we encourage them, use some of this extra money for basic things, materials and supplies for the meetings that you're going to need, or to conduct your ongoing needs assessment, surveys with parents. So it's 150,000, like I said, for the implementation over 3 years. And then when they enter year 4 and kind of graduate out of the program, we have worked with them to build a strategy around how to use their title funds, again, in particular Title I, so that they can sustain it for year 4 and onward.
Yeah. So how is your state thinking about using, the new federal dollars, available, the COVID relief dollars? How are you thinking of using that funding to advance your work in community schools?
Yeah, no, great question. So we have a statewide coalition that represents specifically for community schools. And so my team works closely with them. It includes the president of our labor partners. So labor is definitely involved in how we implement around the community school strategy. And we do that on behalf of our district, so that the state is developing those relationships already at the state level with labor partners. So they definitely are very much encouraging their districts, right, through negotiations, to use these various ESSER funds, CARES, now ARPA funds, to support the community school strategy. There even was a very specific study done on return on investment, right? And that was done in our state a couple of years ago, that showed for every dollar invested in the community school strategy, there was at least $7 return. And that study, I would say, was key for our legislature to really say, we're going to invest even more. We see the effects. Our labor partners are excited about it. They believe in it. And so we're very excited to be able to give the flexibility to districts to use these federal funds, including ARPA, to start thinking about how to braid and sustain it over time. So I think all of those relationships have been really important for our state.
Katarina, one last question before we move on to our next speaker. What advice would you give other education leaders, particularly superintendents, who are learning about this for the first time and are interested in moving forward to really support community schools, especially in this context?
I would encourage superintendents to reach out, and we're happy to, I know Jose and others on the panel, myself included, we're happy to connect you with superintendents who know the strategy and have worked through challenges given their local context, but have really seen the return on investment, have seen the positive effects in their communities, including their negotiations with labor partners. But it's a wonderful strategy for all of our students. In particular, in our case, it has been most effective at combating the effects of poverty, which is something we're very much interested in long-term, right? Most of our students, over 75% of our students qualify for Title I in our state. So we're definitely interested in looking at the economic capacity of our state and making sure that public education lifts our students and families out of poverty to the greatest extent possible.
Thank you so much, Katarina. And we'll move on to our second promising practice. We wanted to start the conversation by, getting to something that we knew, everyone on this call would care about, which is, how do you start community schools? How do you think about, with new funding available, how do you invest community schools with an eye towards the long term, and how will you be able to sustain that over time? So you heard from Katerina, Title I is going to, of the Every Student Succeeds Act, Title IV of the Every Student Succeeds Act are going to be major go-tos. For our second promising practice, we'll hear how the community schools approach can be used to address the immediate need for recovering lost instructional time while supporting long-term child development outcomes. Our next speaker is Sarah Jonas, Executive Director of the Office of Community Schools in the New York City Department of Education. She'll share with us the results of her city's community schools initiative based off an external RAND evaluation. Sarah, please share with us how New York City managed to improve student outcomes in both academic and non-academic measures through its focus on community schools.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristen. It's great to be part of the panel today with Katerina, and I know we'll hear in a little bit from Senator Ervin as well. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to tell you a little bit about New York City community schools and to share with you some of our successes as well as our lessons learned and our vision for the future with this work. So here in New York City, we're home to the nation's largest community schools initiative, and we're very proud of that. In just 7 years, we've scaled community schools from 45 schools to over 300 elementary, middle, and high schools across the 5 boroughs of New York City. And that's ensuring that over 150,000 students and their families benefit from integrated mental health, academic supports, enrichment, and social services. So I'm going to start by just giving you a little bit of background about how our initiative got started. So during the 2013 mayoral campaign, groups of local community and youth advocacy groups launched campaigns and created coalitions to advocate for education policies, reforms, and community-driven school improvements. And the call to invest in community schools was a consistent theme across all of these groups. So then mayoral candidate Bill de Blasio, who had long championed sort of a whole child approach to student learning in New York City, committed to creating 100 new community schools. And during the first year of Mayor de Blasio's administration, our city took critical steps towards making the creation of 100 community schools a reality. And that included the repurposing of $52 million in New York State attendance improvement and dropout prevention funding to support the creation of those first 45 community schools. And from that point, our city moved quickly to organize itself around this unprecedented size and scope of community schools. So I think important to note is that early planning and incubation of the community school initiative was led out of City Hall by the Deputy Mayor for Strategic Policy Initiatives. And this allowed the mayor to stay closely connected to the development of the work and to harness resources from all across our city government, including the Health Department, the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, and the Department of Youth and Community Development. Another critical step was, and I'll speak a little bit more about this in a moment, that in 2015, our city created a principal office called the Office of Community Schools, where I work within the Department of Education, with the twin goals of supporting both the implementation and the scaling of the community school strategy across our city in the years to come. And in May of that same year, the New York City Department of Education and the Mayor's Office released a strategic plan to kind of lay out how community schools would scale across New York City. And importantly, this strategic plan included commitments from more than a dozen city agencies on how they would support the community schools initiative. And this plan resulted in a results framework that clearly articulated both student and school and community level goals for the community schools work in New York City. So New York City defines community schools as an equity strategy. So this is a key to our work here, is that we're starting with the premise that community schools is a key equity strategy to organize resources and share leadership so that academics, health, youth development, and family engagement are integrated into the fabric of schools. And the 4 defining pillars of each New York City community school are aligned to the Learning Policy Institute's research. So every one of our schools is organized around expanded and enriched learning time, active family and community engagement, collaborative leadership and practice, and integrated student supports. And each of our schools partners a school with a community-based organization that receives a multi-year contract from our office, the Office of Community Schools, to provide healthcare, additional learning opportunities, social and emotional supports, and many other services to students and families. And together, the school and the community-based organization hire a community school director to ensure that the right supports get to the right students at the right time, and families, of course, as well. So a little bit on our results. So a growing body of evidence shows that New York City community schools are working and work for our students and families. A multi-year impact study of the New York City Community Schools Initiative conducted by the RAND Corporation, entitled Illustrating the Promise of Community Schools, shows that New York City community schools, in comparison to demographically similar non-community schools, are having a statistically significant impact on a range of outcomes that include chronic absenteeism, graduation rates, math scores, and disciplinary incidents. So I'll share a few examples of the study. So regarding chronic absenteeism, the study found that, in fact, again, students in community schools miss fewer days of school. So chronic absenteeism was 7.3 percentage points lower in community elementary and middle schools, and 8.3 points lower in high schools. And this was especially true for students in temporary housing and for Black students. The study also showed that students in community schools are more likely to graduate on time. In 2017-18, graduation rates in community schools were 7.2 percentage points higher than other comparable high schools. And the study showed that students feel safer and more supported. So for every 100 students in elementary and middle community schools, for example, there were 10 fewer disciplinary incidents per year. The RAND study also found, and I think this is really critical, that the impacts of the community school strategy increase over time. And so this is important because I think it really lends credence to the argument that the schools and students in community schools will continue to reap greater benefits for years to come as the strategy continues to mature. So due to its size, again, we have over 300 schools and serving 150,000 students. The New York City Community School Initiative exceeds the size of most school districts. And so we know that for this reason alone, it might seem challenging to apply our learnings in New York City and our best practices to other school districts that are interested in community schools. However, what makes, I think, our initiative possible and ultimately a success comes down to three key actions that our city took early on in our initiative, which I think are easily adaptable and applicable to any school district. And so I'm going to name each of the three and then talk about each one a little bit more closely. So the first is that we created, as I mentioned, a principal office within our school district to support effective school and community partnerships. The second, we built capacity and spread innovation by offering data tools to community partners and school leaders. And three, we disseminated best practices so that schools and communities can learn from one another and implement the community school strategy with fidelity. In creating a principal office, the Office of Community Schools, our Department of Education sent a clear message that community schools would serve as one of the city's pre-K to 12 educational equity strategies. It also codified a set of expectations for community schools so that families and communities knew what to expect across all New York City community schools. So even though every school is a little different and reflects the community that it lives in and that it operates in, by sort of setting this strategy out from the beginning, we were able to say all community schools have these features and every community school will reflect the particular community that it represents. Another key feature is that we have in our office, we have program managers who serve as key points of contact for cohorts of New York City community schools. Our program managers coach schools and their community partners to establish and maintain strong and effective partnerships. And they provide support to these partnerships to help them engage in collaborative planning and collaborative budgeting to drive the community schools. In addition, to providing coaching, the Office of Community Schools delivers targeted training and technical assistance to community school directors, community partners, principals, and other stakeholders. And this work is supported through contracts with organizations such as the National Center for Community Schools, New Visions for Public Schools, and the United Way of New York City. An important learning for any central government office is to ensure that the office creates structures to equip it to be open to feedback and sharing leadership. And we know how critical these features are to a community school. It's also critical that the office itself, our Office of Community Schools, operates equally that way. And so this is especially true, again, because at its core, Community Schools is working to dismantle the adverse impacts of historical inequities, like Jose spoke about at the beginning, and Katerina as well as systemic racism. And so for our office, a critical aspect of this work of sharing leadership and having a feedback loop with stakeholders was harnessing the voice of students, families, and community members to inform our policy and practice. In 2015, we convened an advisory board composed of advocates, researchers, policymakers, and educators to advise on scaling the community school strategy in New York City. Our office also partners with the Coalition for Community Schools Excellence, which is an advocacy coalition consisting of more than 60 lead community school partner and advocacy organizations. And together we work to develop policies that are responsive to the interests and needs of students and families, and that leverage community strengths, cultural wealth, and knowledge. In addition to the Coalition for Community Schools Excellence, we also partner with the OCS Research Advisory Council. We have an OCS Youth Advisory Council, as well as a variety of partnerships with other agencies, such as those with our Department of Health and Mental Hygiene and our Department of Homeless Services. Our city also built capacity and spread innovation by offering data tools directly to community partners. So New York City community schools have served as laboratories of learning and have been well suited to spread innovations developed in conjunction with the community. And key to this are data-informed collaborative structures that New York City community schools have in place. We know that a common obstacle to community schools work and collective impact work can be access to data. So through a partnership with New Visions for Public Schools, the Office of Community Schools equipped every one of our New York City community schools with an early warning data system that aggregates attendance as well as academic and behavioral data from DOE primary source systems into one place, so that educators together with community partners can monitor trends in student data in real time and share aggregate level data with families at community school forums and other community-wide convenings. And through signing a confidentiality agreement, community-based organizations in community schools can serve as on-site supports to the Department of Education and can have access to the student level data, which has led to increased collaboration, again, to meet student needs in real time. In 2018, our office built an open source assets and needs assessment tool in-house, which any school in any city can use to ascertain community strengths and needs. And again, any school district can, as we have done, leverage in-house data systems or third-party organizations and data tools for the use of data for continuous improvement. And as a best practice, I would share that we implemented the data tool in phases, beginning with 45 community schools in our first year. We know that there may be obstacles that school districts might encounter trying to do this along the way, including navigating FERPA and student privacy laws. But again, we're happy to continue to talk to other districts and serve as a resource around how to provide partners and schools with guidance to use, for example, these confidentiality agreements, as well as other policies to ensure that both schools and community partners are equipped with this data to help bring about a successful transformation through their community school strategy. And lastly, we disseminated best practices so that schools and communities can learn from one another and implement the community school strategy with fidelity. So since the start of our initiative, the Office of Community Schools has worked with our partners to create networks of support called communities of practice. And these are places where role-alike stakeholders can engage in the implementation of the community school strategy. Through these communities of practice, our school and community stakeholders have shared ideas, lessons learned, and best practices around a wide array of topics, including attendance improvement, teaching and learning, after-school programming, working with vulnerable populations, as well as efforts around how to build equity and inclusion through community schools. As an example, when our schools shuttered their doors in March of 2020, many of our New York City community schools were able to quickly pivot, and by leaning on this sort of network of communities of practice, our community schools were able to build on the trusting relationships that they had formed with communities and families and quickly adapt their approach to the virtual learning environment to meet the emergent needs of our students and families. So for example, many of our community schools equipped families with essential resources such as fresh produce, hot meals, and technology devices, again, through engaging across these communities of practice. So I'd like to just share a few final thoughts about the vision for sustaining and growing New York City community schools.
And Sarah, I'm going to hold you to 1 minute more.
Great. The community school strategy has been central, as I talked about, to our ongoing citywide effort to meet the mental health needs of children in the wake of the pandemic. And so I'm really excited to share that our city has invested in creating 32 new community schools to open this fall in the neighborhoods hardest hit by COVID. And we've committed to expanding by an additional 100 new community schools to open in July of 2022. And to recognize and honor the fact that it takes time to build the relationships necessary for successful implementation and impact, I just want to emphasize that our contracts with our community-based organizations are long-term 3-year contracts, renewable for another 3 years. And our funding for all of this effort is braided and draws from local, state, and federal sources, including grants such as 21st Century Community Learning Centers and private philanthropy. So in closing, I just hope that our experience in New York City and our lessons learned will be useful to other districts as you embark on this work to leverage federal, state, and local efforts to recover from COVID-19 and address educational inequity while laying the foundation for a vision of equitable education through community schools in the years and months ahead. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And we have a number of questions for you. Folks, we'll do our best to get through as many of these as we can while holding to our 10-minute limitation for this afternoon. So Sarah, first question. You mentioned that advocacy by community members helped launch community schools. ARPA, so the COVID relief dollars, requires the engagement of stakeholders in the creation of state and district plans. With so many community schools, how are you doing that?
Great. So I mentioned, so a couple of different ways. I mentioned our relationship with the Coalition for Community Schools Excellence. So I think one important sort of takeaway is having ongoing engagement with your lead community-based partners and other community advocates. We meet with the Coalition for Community Schools regularly, monthly, sometimes more than once a month. And it becomes a feedback loop where we're able to sort of talk about like how community schools is actually getting implemented on the ground, how our practitioners and stakeholders are experiencing the policies that are coming out of our office, and also then informing the policies that we're creating to support successful work. And the other piece of this that I would say I mentioned briefly is our community school forums. So every spring, each of our community schools comes together with the school and community members, students, and families, and reflects back on the year and looks forward. So looks at data, talks about what worked and didn't, and co-creates a vision for the community school for the coming year. So those are 2 examples.
Yeah, and it's perhaps the forum also is related to this next question. So what does collaborative planning and budgeting look like in community schools? Are families and students part of the school teams making decisions around spending?
Great. So that's a great question. And that's something that we really built out over time. So we're really proud of the collaborative planning model that we built across our schools. Each of our community schools has 3 formal collaborative planning meetings each school year. And together with, again, our community partners, we developed agendas for each of those 3 meetings that involve, again, like looking at data, looking at the goals that the community school set out for itself, building on that forum that they may have had the previous spring, right? Whatever the goals and vision that was set in place throughout the year, through those 3 collaborative planning meetings, community school stakeholders that include the community-based partner, the principal, other leaders in the school, students, and family members come together, look together at the data, look at how they're implementing and leveraging resources. How does that line up with the vision that they set out for themselves, and then make adjustments accordingly in terms of how they're allocating resources for their community school.
And just like Katerina, we also have a question about the coming relief dollars. And this question is about shared governance structures. You shared a couple of those shared governance structures, but how are you engaging, with stakeholders to determine how relief dollars will be spent?
That's a great question. So I'm very excited that actually sort of hot off the press, we worked with the Coalition for Community Schools Excellence and other stakeholders and members of our office. We're actually later this month, we're holding 2 community school citywide forums. So we took the idea that each of our community schools, as I mentioned, has a community school forum every spring. So we decided to take that idea big. And so we're actually implementing kind of borough-wide, citywide community school forums, bringing together stakeholders from across our community schools and across our city to come together and talk together again about both looking back, what have our successes been as an initiative, what have some of our challenges been, and then really drawing on community input and stakeholder input to say, what should our vision look like for community schools moving forward? What do we want to see happen in the coming years? And so through that community school forum and engagement, being able to work with our community school communities and our broader community to inform that vision for what this work should look like and how to leverage these opportunities that we have in the moment and moving forward.
Yeah. Sarah, you've talked about just the strong infrastructure that you have in place, the principal office, the community forum. So for states and districts that have an opportunity to use, these COVID relief dollars to implement community schools, how would you recommend that they start, given that many of them may not have the same strong infrastructure that you spoke of?
Yeah, so kind of thinking back to the beginning, I think a couple of folks here have also mentioned, I think, assets and needs assessments is a really important process, right? So helping, and again, I think someone asked, I can put in the chat the link to our assets and needs assessment tool, but I think really starting with working with communities to talk together about, what are the strengths, what are the assets, and what are the needs in each particular community to help drive next steps is really important. So that should be, I think, a critical first step in terms of envisioning what this work should look like and how it should develop moving forward. And I think then drawing on that assets and needs assessment process to drive both the broader vision and at an individual school level, what types of programs, services, and partnerships, would help support the community school. And through if that process, through doing that process together with community stakeholders, you're also then building kind of a groundswell of community support, interest, and investment in this work moving forward. So I think that that's really important as a starting place.
So we have a question about the indicators that you're using to track the effectiveness of social, emotional, and mental health supports. I mean, for the study, you talked about the implications for chronic absenteeism for grad rates. You talked about disciplinary indicators, but what indicators are you looking at to assess, how community schools, affects the social, emotional, mental health well-being of your students?
Sure, and I can also follow up with folks on sort of more specifics about the RAND study, but I will say that one of the pieces that we look at in New York City is we have a student and family survey that we conduct each spring, and the survey has questions about sort of related to student connectedness, so different metrics that help determine how strongly connected a student and their family feels to school. So I think that piece around student belonging and student connectedness is really a critical piece to looking at larger kind of issues around school climate and how well community schools are impacting both the individual student experience and the overall school climate as well.
Looking around for other questions. So one of our questioners says that this sounds like very transformative culture shift work. So what have been the biggest challenges to implementation at the school site level, and how have you addressed those?
That's a great question. So I think one thing that we often talk about is that working in this way is a big shift. It's like a mindset shift, both for school leaders, principals, as well as for community-based organizations. So many of them have not necessarily worked in this type of sort of integrated, collaborative, in this collaborative leadership model before. So I think some of it is just helping to support school leaders and their partners with this sort of thinking as partners, as opposed to somehow the more traditional kind of vendor relationship that schools and community partners sometimes have with one another, and which we know is, kind of antithetical to a successful community school. And I think that's where, I talked about before, some of those investments in capacity building and sort of support for partnership development and partnership sustainability are really critical as well. So I think that's one of the challenges that I think can certainly be overcome, but it requires like nurturing and attention. So that's one that I would lift up.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for your time. We'll continue moving on with today's event. For our third promising practice, we'll hear about how investing in expanding community schools can now lay the groundwork for long-term community development. So our last speaker today is Senator Irving of Arkansas, who will share why the state just passed legislation to expand community schools. Senator Irving, please share with us how Arkansas made the decision to make this long-term investment to drive not only student success, but broad community level outcomes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Senator Missy Irvin from Arkansas, and I'm very pleased to be with all of you. I had the opportunity to discuss community schools approach with different organizations. Forward Arkansas is one of those organizations. But I also came to this piece of legislation and through honestly just I think digging deep within my experience and then my district and what I see across the state of Arkansas. Arkansas, you've just heard, from New York City and a very different scenario, clearly from rural Arkansas. I represent probably one of the most rural areas of the state of Arkansas. You literally have to probably have a boat or a horse to get to some of my areas because of the lakes and the streams and the terrain is very mountainous. I'm in the Ozark Mountains region. But investing in a community school approach, in my opinion, really allows for your state governments to effectively partner with your communities in a more cohesive way. And I believe that that really drives your economic development specific to that area. And when I say that, to me, I'm always interested from a state legislative perspective as to how do we bottle up the great stuff that's happening in different schools around the state of Arkansas? How do we bottle that up and how do we share that effectively? And how do we do it in a way that we know is going to make improvements, not only just for those students, but for those families and those communities? And how do we grow those economies, but grow those economies in a way that's very specific to that area? And that's where I see community school model coming into play for a long-term community development. And when I talk about this, it's going to be a very different, probably, set of language that I might use that's very different from New York or other places. But it really comes from the area that I think I live in. I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, the large city of Little Rock. I attended private schools. But my husband and I made the decision to move to Mountain View, Arkansas, which is a very rural area in the state of Arkansas, very, very small, about 3,000 people in the town of Mountain View. And the county, I think, has about 12,000 people in it. But that choice was really to look at where were the public schools that we felt our kids, our children, we have 4, could really have an opportunity not only just to be themselves, but to kind of learn from the community that they're in. And so, it was really a decision that we made about that whole person of my child. It wasn't necessarily that I was looking for a school that had this phenomenal, AP set of curriculum or an IB curriculum. I'm familiar with all that, but I really wanted my children to learn from the community that they were raised in. And I think the community school approach, to me, and how it's been being enacted in the state of Arkansas, really takes into account the particular geographic, economic, social aspects of that community and integrates it into the school, just like it did years and years and years ago. And I'm going to talk about 3 different areas that I think are reflective as to why I think the community school approach and the legislation I passed gives us a pathway down that towards that inclusion and equal opportunities for kids. But those opportunities look very differently wherever you are located. In Mountain View, Arkansas, where I grew up, where I live, and my 4 children have graduated from high school, we have a program there called the Music Roots program. The Music Roots program was developed from the community. And what it does is it really was started under Jimmy Driftwood. Jimmy Driftwood, if you don't know him, he was a Grammy Award winning musician. He was from Timbo, Arkansas, Stone County. He was a history teacher. And the way that he taught his students history was he wrote songs. and he wrote The Battle of New Orleans, which he won a Grammy Award for. Jimmy Driftwood was very instrumental in making sure that Mountain View and Stone County and that community really remained true to its roots and the music. And so we are the folk music capital of the world. And so we have a Music Roots program that provides a free instrument to every child, starting in the grade of fourth grade, from fourth grade all the way through 12th grade, and free instruction during the class day. So it's not after school, it's actually integrated into that class, into their day of curriculum. And they can learn how to play the guitar, the banjo, the dulcimer, the mandolin, the auto harp, and the banjo. And starting at fourth grade, and they get an instrument for free. And the reason that this program was put into place was really about making sure that that music, which is really an oral folklore and its oral tradition of the history of Arkansas and this region, this area, that it survived, right? That it lived on beyond just the generation, the older generation. And so the Music Roots program, to me, really is one thing that I thought about whenever we were doing this legislation, and how a community school approach really does foster that type of a development and integration and collaboration with the community. Looks very different, obviously, from where you might find someplace else. But to me, that Music Roots program is such a clear example of a community that went to the school and integrated with the school to keep the music tradition alive. And it gave those kids the opportunity to learn how to play an instrument, but that's a mental health issue for these kids too. So many kids cannot verbalize what's going on with them at their home or within their life, but they can use music, they can use art, they can use dance to really express themselves. And so the Music Roots program gives them that opportunity, but it also gives them an opportunity for work and success later in their life. We have kids that have grown up through this program that are now songwriters, that are working in using their incredible talents in so many different ways. There's a song called Mountain View by Lane Long. I'm going to put a plug in for him. He's a young man that graduated from our school, but it's just such a great example of, to me, that Music Roots program that was integrated into the school because it grew out of the community, that was very specific in particular. And so the community school legislation really provides a path and a clear process for a director, a plan, professional development, and then those measures to really measure the goals and the outcomes and set those goals and what we're trying to accomplish. And I really believe on focusing on points of agreement. And I think that's where it looks different with a community school approach, and how you pass legislation and how you create legislation to accommodate all different sizes and variations of your schools and areas of your state and what they may look like, is you focus on the points of agreement. And I think we all can agree that we want children to have a more successful life, and that we want them to focus on their families and focus on their communities, and we want families to focus on their children. We want to build strong communities, and we want to see that integration, and we want to see more collaboration with each other. We want more dialogue with each other, and students learn from their communities, and they learn how to solve problems with their community leaders. The second example I'll share with you is the Batesville School District. They are a community school currently, and they're in rural Arkansas, about 45 minutes from Mountain View. And really their approach is really trying to take a deep dive and to figure out who these students are, where their needs are, what their families are going through, and how we just can connect the dots for them and provide the opportunity to say, okay, well, this is available for you and this is available for you, and how can I plug you in, and how can I get you connected maybe with a family that's going through something similar or that already has. And how can we help you get to the next level and reach the goals that you're trying to reach? It's really all about collaboration and connecting. To me, that's boom. Community schools are about collaborating and connecting. And a lot of times my husband's a family practice physician, and we are small town doctor. He takes care of animals when the veterinarian's out of town. It's definitely Dr. Doolittle. But it's really about, we came there and started the first rural residency program for UAMS. And for us, it was really a mission about rural healthcare and increasing the opportunities for those rural Arkansans, because we're there, because we're able to say, well, we've been through this, let me help you down that path. And so the coolest thing in the world for me was when my husband came home the other day and he showed me a student whose parents did not have money to pay for the ACT. And my husband paid for the ACT for this young man. And he scored, I think, a 28 and got a full scholarship to one of the Arkansas schools, and now has graduated and is a teacher. And, I just think, no, it's not about practicing medicine, and it's not about just treating the flu. It's about, okay, what do you need from me? And I have, lived this life. I know how to do this with my kids. How can I help these other kids who may not have that same infrastructure in place? And that's what a community school does, is it brings all of those components together so that their students, no matter where they come from, no matter what they look like, no matter how much money they make or how much money they, don't have, it's really about going, okay, well, we know how to do this, and we know that this person knows how to do it. We're going to connect you, and we're going to let you mentor and help that student get to a place where they can improve their situations and their family situations. And the last thing I'll talk about, and the Batesville Community School approach is really a one way that we were able to pass the legislation, because we had great, strong testimony from those teachers and administrators and directors. The EAST program is another one I want to talk about, and then technology. EAST is a program that was started in Greenbrier, Arkansas, and it's really a technology-based super lab. And what it does is, and it's across the country, but to me, it's a wonderful community school vehicle, because EAST Initiative, you can go online and look that up. It really utilizes technology to solve problems that exist in your community. And so the students, it's kind of this super technology lab, and what you do as a student in EAST is you work on a problem that's in your community, and you work to solve it using the technology that's given to you. So for example, my daughter is a big EAST girl, and I'm a typical mom. I'm going to brag about my kids, but we needed a humane society. And so EAST had the Bentley and ArchiCAD software there in part of their lab, which is the industry standard for architecture. And she worked with a local individual who came from Silicon Valley to Mountain View, Arkansas. He was an astrophysicist, believe it or not, and who taught her high-level physics. Again, community approach. And she developed and put those plans into the architecture software and won a national award for her work, designed the Humane Society. They, along with her Beta Club, helped raise money to build the Humane Society and shelter, and it's now built. She did all the electrical work, layout, and then put the plans, architectural plans, into the software design. So solving a community problem. And just an incredible example, I think, of how you utilize technology. The last thing I would say really about a whole person approach is Smart Data Dashboard. Smart Data Dashboard is a technology system that was developed by a friend of mine at Mountain Home, Arkansas, named Harvey Hughes. And what Harvey has done with the Smart Data Dashboard, and we're utilizing it in the state of Arkansas, is we know how to use grades A, B, C, D, and F to know where kids fall academically, right? We use that as a grading system. And so we know if a kid is got a C, well, we need to work to get them to an A. But how do we know that with what's going on with them in their personal lives? And we don't know that. And so what Harvey developed was getting the ability to have a dashboard that really will show where a child is mentally and behaviorally, and tracking attendance and tracking those red flags and providing a dashboard so that students and teachers can pull that up immediately and go, okay, I know where my top 10 in academic distress are. Where are my top 10 in distress in life? Being able to get all that information into a dashboard for your schools, and then utilizing the community school approach to address where we can plug this kid in so that we move them off of that, top 10 list of where the red flags are into a place where we're meeting the needs of where that kid is. He developed this program and this software because a school had a young lady who committed suicide. And that school reached out to him and said, you know what, all the red flags were there. All the indicators were there once they sat down after the fact, unfortunately, and had the discussion around this young lady. They were all there. They just weren't in one place. They were kind of in different file cabinets. And what he did was create a dashboard to really be able to see that information in one place for specific people so that we could track and know what's going on with these kids in their lives. And so I think, that there's so much discussion as to how we can integrate your local police unit, law enforcement, community school resource officers, how they can help in that issue. So I see technology as driving that. And so, for me, it was just a good success to be able to pass the legislation.
Thank you so much, Senator. And we have about maybe 5 minutes for question and answers. So please do send in your questions. So we heard, Senator, from the last speaker about how community schools was really put forward as an equity strategy within New York City public schools. Could you speak to how you see the intersection between the legislation that was just passed and the opportunities to promote equity in Arkansas schools?
Sure. I think we take for granted where kids are and their equal opportunities. And so I may speak a little differently about that than others, but some kids just don't have the same opportunities that other kids have. And we know that. And for me, I think, or for Arkansas, it's really where you're located. A lot of it has to do with your geography, but also your background and your socioeconomic background. And some of those kids just don't have the same opportunities that other kids have. And so I think when you start to bring in a community school approach, what we've seen at Batesville, for instance, is, well, these kids, they need the ability to have a backpack of food sent home with them. They need the ability to have breakfast in the morning, or we need to understand that their dynamic at home is that they can't participate in sports or youth activities because their family has no car. And so the only way into town for this one child is because he can ride the bus. And that's the only ride into town. And so really understanding those dynamics, I think for me, provides the opportunity for more of an equal opportunity for those kids, so that we're not making assumptions about them, but that we are going based on knowledge of what's actually going on with their families and the children and those students. And so I think, for me, a lot of this integrates into Medicaid, our foster care situation. And, I, as a state legislator, I always want to look at where can we move from a fail first policy to early detection and prevention. And so too often our systems are waiting till we fail and then we move in with intervention. I just that makes no sense to me. We have enough money to move from fail first to early intervention and early detection. And so, and really, it's heartbreaking to think that we would wait for a student or a child to fail before we would act to make a corrective approach. We really should try to go in early and detect where that is. And that gets me to, that's an equal opportunity if you look at every kid. So if we know that something works, we should apply it across the board, and we shouldn't discriminate. And we shouldn't make assumptions, about a kid, no matter what. And so it's really, I think, about our approach rises everybody. It's just the way we go about doing that. And I'm interested in equal opportunities for all kids, because you may have a kid that looks like they're able to succeed. They may be, we may look at assumptions of them and go, oh, they're fine. They come from a wealthy family, blah, blah, blah. That might be the kid that's struggling the most. You just don't know, you've got to. And so I think you look at it and say, what are we doing and how can we adjust our approach so that we're not discriminating against any person, but that we're applying an approach that gives the equal opportunity for all of those kids to learn in a way that helps everybody, no matter where they're at and what's going on with them.
Thank you so much, Senator. And actually, that will conclude our Promising Practices lightning round. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for joining us for this conversation. I'll turn things over. Jose, I see you turned your camera on. I'm going to turn things over to you.
No, thank you. Thank you. I want to thank you, Senator Irvin. I want to thank Kata Sandoval. I also want to thank Sarah Jonas for taking the time and sharing with us how important this moment is for community school and this great opportunity that we have as a movement moving forward together. One thing, and I read the chat and the questions there, I know there's some controversy that's brought up in the chat as well too. And I come from a standpoint of all children need this. And if all we do is look for holes, we'll poke them. But if all we look for is pathways forward, we'll walk them. And so I think as we look at collaboration, regardless of the political spectrum that each of us may vote and some of the disagreements that we may have, this is a moment of unity. This is a moment where we come together. Regardless of how we start or how we agree, there's some key things that have been discussed in this conversation today. It's about collaboration. It's about community voice. It's about walking alongside of young people and doing with them and not to them. About working with families. I heard about community development. I heard economic prosperity. I heard racial and social justice. I heard social and emotional, taking care of social and emotional needs. There's so much that is to pack. I heard data and evaluation, that there are proof points in this. And so building upon that, I think we do that and we continue to build upon what we are learning through community schools historically and what we're learning during this crazy time we are all moving through to begin to come to build on that community wisdom, to invest in trusting relationships during this moment, and then also to commit to getting better. Regardless of how we start, we're here for our young people, and we can only do it alongside with them. With that, I have a great pleasure of introducing Hema Quetzal, who is one of the co-chairs for a Next Generation Coalition that was designed by young people and led by young people. But there's one thing that they've been consistent on, is they said, we need to walk alongside our partners. Hema was mentioned in the beginning, and I'll just share that I don't want to steal any of your thunder, so you can add to it, Hema. But Hema was part of a passing of the torch, so to speak, in 2018 from Roscoe Jones Sr., who was one of the original NAACP teen leaders, to this next generation. And from a Cheesecake Factory conversation, Hema and her friends and her peers talked about what about our way forward? What about how do we play a role in the Coalition for Community Schools? And it was at that moment that we said, well, let's work together and design this. And they've done a beautiful job. I'll let you talk about that, Hema. But I'm also so proud about the persistence and the perseverance that you and your peers have endured through a pandemic, because this could have easily stopped. And you guys have persevered, learning and leaning in from even more young people. So Hema, how have community schools had an impact on young people coming from a community school district, the first in the country, Oakland Unified School District? And what would you recommend to us? How do we use funding so that we can grow community schools across this country?
For sure. Thank you so much for your question. I just want to first by saying that, yes, I'm from Oakland, but I always like to mention my neighborhood. I'm from East Oakland, California. That's where I grew up. That's where my roots is. And that's very specific to my experience. And if you know East Oakland, California, it's also a majority low-income community of color that's very under-resourced. However, despite this under-resourced of schools, these schools have given me the opportunity and my peers the opportunity to not feel that our schools are separate from our community. Often schools for many years have been a conversation of, you're entering this school and this is different from where you're from your neighborhood. No, a community school is part of it. When I entered my high school, that was also my middle school because it was a 6th to 12th, I was entering a space that was still part of my community. In the classroom where I was learning around different issues impacting my community, it was more than just like learning about these different issues. I was finding solutions. And I think that's the something that's inherently true about community schools, is that they find solutions to problems that occur. And this is super important because in spaces where community schools are there to solve these long-term problems, it's building new leaders to have the opportunity to be like, hey, what can we do to not reinvent the wheel, but go forward? And so I think that's what's truly amazing about community schools in my experience. And me as a student, because I went to a community school district, I had the opportunity and along my peers to be part of a student union that allowed us to make decisions around community schools, saying, hey, not only what issues do you see in your school, but hey, what can we do together? And I want to emphasize the together part in order to find these solutions. And this didn't only include students, this included parents, families, community organizers, those who all knew these issues existed, but they work with administrators and teachers to find these solutions and create amazing programs such as a restorative justice program that instead of, punishing students and suspending them, they're talking about how do we restore and heal as a community and really go towards equity. And that's another part of community schools, is that there's always that equity piece that I always saw. And that's why community schools are so amazing, because no matter what, they're inherently about equity. No matter your sexual identity, your gender identity, your race, your class, you are allowed in this space and it's equitable. Especially as a queer Latina student, I want to emphasize that a community school is safe regardless of your immigration status, regardless of the color of your skin, and regardless whether if you are trans or not. That is a space for you. And this is super important that I want to emphasize, that we need to protect community schools for all students, because there's so many problems happening in the United States and it's important. And with COVID, we see these problems. COVID did not only show us what was wrong with the education system, it showed that we all had to work together to solve these problems. And I think that's what's amazing about community schools, is that this is something that it's going to be hard to work towards, right? This is not something that can happen overnight, but this is something that we all have to put our hands towards. And so I really want to put y'all with this, is that out of here, coming out of this conference, you want to talk to your community members and be like, it's all hands on deck. And this is not only policymakers and leaders, this is our parent leaders, our student leaders, our community members, and working together to make community schools a reality for amazing equity in our education system and beyond that. Thank you.
You are always so amazing. I'm glad to be your friend. Hema, what has the community school movement done for you in your trajectory in the future?
I mean, it definitely made it clear that if there's one thing I want to do is advocate for justice. I'm currently attending Stanford University. I'm a sophomore there, and I'm majoring in comparative studies and race and ethnicity, which is really ethnic studies. And my goal is to really work in policy in the future, and or work in civil rights. I haven't decided specifically if I want to be a civil rights lawyer or if I just want to work in policy, but I definitely will be advocating for social justice and equity in my future. And community schools really grounded me in that because it was inherently always about that.
No, thank you. Always so powerful. So this is one of those moments right now where we have an influx of resources that every community across this country, if we all got together in states and local communities and send resource, actually collaboration, resource, people actually coming to the table and talk about what are the issues that they want to address together, whatever that may be across the walks of life. So Hema, I guess the urging is for us to use this federal funding as that resource to continue these conversations. Is that correct?
Yes. And someone asked what community school I went to. I went to Life Academy of Health and Bioscience, a part of the Oakland Unified School District in the Fruitvale District of East Oakland. So I just want to mention that and give a shout out to my community school.
I appreciate it. So I want to thank again all the Hema, you for really closing us out greatly. And then for all of our other panelists and Brookings and all those who attended as well too. If you want to continue this conversation on May 26th, you'll be receiving an invite. If you could just say the date from 12 to 1:30 for us on the East Coast lunchtime and in a West Coast breakfast time, maybe, or at least coffee time. We'll dig a little bit deeper into some of the tactical ways that you can use this funding for community schools. If you want to have a broader conversation, we have a family and community engagement conference coming the first week of June. It is completely virtual. During that conference, we'll have a session of how do you build ecosystems to grow and sustain community schools. So we hope to see you all there. If you want to stay connected to the coalition, you can email us at ccs@iel.org. Depending on where you are in your walk of life, whether you're a young person, as Hema just talked about the Next Generation Coalition, or somewhere in your professional career, there is a way for you to connect. If you'd like to connect and stay connected, just email us at ccs@iel.org. Let us know that you want to be connected, what your position is and where you are in the country, and we'll get you connected for that. I want to thank you all once again for attending and hope to see you soon at one of those upcoming events, May 26th or first week of June. Have a great week.